Dear esteemed guests, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. We still have lots of people coming in, but I'm going to start our panel as we are running late. So I would like to introduce our next panel to you, the role of private sector for sustainable development goals. Our moderator today is Ms. Gülçin Salıngan, Deputy Director, UNDP Istanbul International Center for Private Sector in Development. Mr. Volkmar Klein, our speakers, Deputy Director, Global Policy Advisor, UNDP Extractive Industries and Sustainable Development. Ms. Christian Labs, Director, KfW Office Tajikistan, KfW Development Bank. And Mr. Mazen Ibrahim Rajab, Chairman of Saudi Turkish Business Council, Saudi Chamber of Commerce and Industry. The stage is yours, Gülçin Salıngan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of UNDP, Istanbul International Center for Private Sector in Development, I would like to welcome you all joining us here today. We will be discussing the role of private sector in global development agenda this afternoon. We do not have only a very challenging subject, but we also have the challenge of running this panel just after lunch. Fortunately, we have four very interesting and distinguished panelists who will overcome both of these challenges. Thank you for being with us. Actually, I would like to start by asking you, inviting you to think about the big picture we have on our planet today, about all these problems that we are facing globally. It seems like we have at least one global issue for each of the letter of the alphabet. We have global issues on AIDS, biodiversity, climate change, environment. We have problems in food security, in growth, health, inequality. We've been constantly hit by the natural disasters, wars, terrorist attacks, so on and so forth. I'm sure each of you can easily expand the list. But is this the whole picture? Not really. While the headlines often focus on what is wrong, in many ways, the world is also getting better. Health is improving, poverty is shrinking, and knowledge is growing. Technological progress improves the quality of our lives. And besides all this, the world leaders has committed and agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals to make the world a better place. I do not want to get into SDGs as they have been already discussed during the previous sessions. I would rather quote Rumi, who once said, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I'm changing myself." The global agenda is actually serving almost the same purpose. It will guide the world nations to change themselves to save the planet for the next 15 years. The agenda, with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, has been both applauded and also dismissed by being too ambitious. Well, whether the goals are too ambitious to be reached or ambitious enough to bring the nations together, making progress on the SDGs will definitely bring out a better world. But how is it going to happen? Well, estimates on the financial needs for implementing the SDGs, as previously discussed, run between 5 to 7.5 trillion US dollar every year for the next 15 years. There is a shortage of 2.5 trillion US dollar for the investments in the developing world for the next 15 years every year. This massive gap actually demonstrates the need for the active involvement of all stakeholders, including the private sector, besides the government. Well, of course, this is not to say that governments need to come up with these financial resources to fill this gap, but rather this gap constitutes the huge opportunity for businesses. The private sector investments, if designed properly in fast-growing markets of the developing world, can yield higher returns, investment returns. But of course, this requires a completely different mindset, such as inclusive business, a model that is innovative and sustainable. What is an inclusive business? We've been discussing this during the previous 2 years. It's a private sector approach to providing goods, services, and livelihoods on a commercially viable basis to people living at the base of the economic pyramid. Basically, making the poor part of the value chain of the businesses as either suppliers or retailers or customers. By including them in companies' core activity, inclusive businesses creates value for both the enterprises and the poor. The model is beyond the corporate philanthropy or social responsibility programs, as they operate on commercial terms, generating a direct return on investment, unlike the corporate philanthropic activities. I would like to just share with you a specific example. The Ukrainian company called Widmark, through an inclusive business model, succeed to increase its market share from 7% to 22% in less than 5 years. The company basically trained the smallholders in its region to improve the product quality and start buying the raw materials directly from them. The approach basically decreased the cost, saw the prices, and increased quality, secured the supply chain, and also created value for all stakeholders, including the consumers of that region. Well, though the number of inclusive businesses has risen substantially during the last decade, it is still far from the desired level. The G20 Inclusive Business Framework, which was produced by our center together with World Bank, summarized the challenges for the inclusive business scale-up under 4 titles. One is the unfriendly regulations and rules. Second is the short of financial resources. And the third and fourth are the lack of capacity and information in these markets. So what can be done to tackle these challenges? These will be our questions to our panelists this afternoon. So I would like to start with you, Mr. Klein. You are in such a unique position, having served on the private sector side previously before becoming a member of the Bundestag in 2009. How do you think the governments perceive inclusive business, especially coming from Germany? And what policies are needed to get more private sector engagement in sustainable development goals?
So, Excellencies, distinguished audience, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for those questions, but let me start with a congratulation. So, I think it's remarkable to attend a major business conference focusing on development issues. Back in Germany, development issues are usually discussed from the development community rather than from the business community, and I appreciate it very much because we need more businesses involved in development. And let me put this into an analogy. So almost everybody is somehow familiar with soccer, with football. And I think economy is pretty much similar to football. On the football ground, you need open space, you need freedom to develop your strategy in order to get the goal, to make the match successful. But that obviously does not mean that everybody can do what he wants. No complete freedom. Without rules, a football match would end up, obviously, in a disaster. And it's not only important to have rules. Rules are necessary, not regarding what contents, but definitely the same rules for all participants. And rules are not enough. You have to have a referee. The rules have to be enforced, and in case the referee should be in the position to impose sanctions. But as soon as the referee starts to interact in the match, as soon as he hits the ball by himself, again, it's the end of a successful football match. And I think in economy, it's the same. And in many developing countries, both mistakes, the absence of rules, or a referee which is playing himself, is quite common. And in some developing countries, even both mistakes are done simultaneously. So first, the state is a bad entrepreneur. We know it from our own records, focusing on the former East Bloc, the command economy on the former East Bloc. Being an entrepreneur itself, it's hardly possible to supervise properly. And I think we have too long relied on state as a development partner in order to create jobs and to gain poverty alleviation, though we know by our own experience that the role of private companies for creating jobs are crucial. And well, the second problem is that without proper rules, there is no confidence, no reliability, and subsequently, obviously, no investor. Or there are investors, but based on bribes and corruption, far away from efficiency. And revenues consisting of royalties and taxes don't find their way into the state budget and don't accommodate the country's needs. Therefore, we need good governance and a set of regulations that fits, which implement social and environmental standards. And that must be the precondition of private investment, which is definitely needed. I wonder whether smart entrepreneurs have to be convinced to serve the bottom of the pyramid, because they do, they often do, and even in Africa, and we just learned in the Ukraine. In Africa, mobile communication, including the transfer of money on remote marketplaces, are done by mobile phones. And it is the bottom of the pyramid. Economies of scale are a good argument to serve the bottom of the pyramid, and inclusive businesses, therefore, I think, must be more than just caring about customers. So microfinance and microinsurance, very important, both in German development policies, are meant to create entrepreneurs. Inclusion of women is very, very important and successful, as we already learned from the Nobel laureate Mohamed Yunus. How to adjust regulation and how to create incentives and to achieve a fair and inclusive economy. I think it's crucial because it's not only a question of creating jobs and creating taxpayers. For me, as a member of the Budget Committee of the Parliament, of course, I like taxpayers and I like creating taxpayers, and they are needed to fund infrastructure, environment issues, everything. But at the end of the day, it's much more than funding. Because if there is somebody who pays taxes, he will definitely ask different questions to his government. So civil society will become stronger and stronger if there are people who pay taxes and who ask their governments, what are you doing with my money? As soon as the government is depending on official development assistance from abroad, nobody, not enough people domestically asked questions. And therefore, I think it's definitely important to strengthen investment, to foster entrepreneurship, not only in agriculture or handicraft. We have to create IT founder centers at African universities, for example, because the graduates from IT have to have their jobs, not only in agriculture. Let's work on it. Let's join forces between state activities and corporate life. And therefore, I wish very, very good success for this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Klein. I fully agree. We need the rules and regulations for control purposes, but more than anything else, probably to establish enabling environments for the models to scale up, such as inclusive business. And I think governments start to become aware of it more and more each passing day. China has already declared that they will be supporting the inclusive business framework under their presidency in G20. And I'm sure Germany, as a strong supporter of the concept, will be contributing significantly during their presidency in 2017 after China. Now, I would like to go back to the challenges that we discussed previously. One of the 4 challenges that prevents the scaling up the inclusive businesses was the financial resources. The conventional finance providers, unfortunately, not enthusiastic or ready always to finance the inclusive businesses. They often consider the risks higher than the returns. So, Ms. Labs, as the director of KfW, the German Development Bank in Tajikistan, and having more than 20 years of private sector experience, what do you think it would take for the development banks to invest more in inclusive business? And also, what do you think the government policy changes would make it more interesting and attractive for the development organizations or banks such as KfW to invest in inclusive business?
Thank you very much, Gülçin, for this very important questions. Excellencies, distinguished participants, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for conveying this important conference, bringing representatives from the private sector with development organizations, academia, and businesses together. I would also like to congratulate the Turkish government for putting the focus of Turkey's G20 agenda on small, medium enterprises, and particularly putting together inclusiveness, implementation, and investment, and that by this you align the G20 agenda with the UN 2030 agenda of Sustainable Development Goals. I'm now facing the Bosporus in front of me, besides your distinguished audience, of course, and that reminds me that 1 week before, in the Pamir region, which is the border region between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, at the Panj River, I opened a cross-border market which was financed with grant funds from the German government. It was implemented through KfW, through the bank for which I'm working in Tajikistan. And the purpose of this very small investment, what we are financing there, is to enable traders from the Afghan side of the border to come to Tajikistan to sell their products like skins and wools of animals, and to buy from Tajik traders food products, vegetables, fruits, which are not available on the other side of the border. And this is a very small example where such an investment can trigger employment, can create jobs, and can contribute to poverty eradication. Besides, the objective of this project is to bring the people together, also to bring, for example, Afghan women to the Tajik cross-border markets to give them trainings, and by bringing people together to contribute to regional stability. I start with this example because it is just one of the examples how we as the promotional bank of the German government, we as KfW in Tajikistan and in many other countries around the globe try to support the sustainable development of the private sector. Personally, I strongly believe that employment is the most important means of social inclusion. And only once jobs are created and enterprises are secured, this leads to stable income, and then the other needs and demands can also be addressed much more successfully. To outline what we are doing in Tajikistan, KfW Development Bank carries out Germany's financial cooperation with developing countries. And one of the sectors in which we are working is to strengthen private sector development. We do this through investments into the financial sector, which means that grant money from the German government is on-lended through microfinance institutions and banks in Tajikistan to promote rural development, to give loans to smallest enterprises, to buy agricultural equipment, to set up processing workshops, for example. The money, which is repaid by banks and microfinance institutions to the Tajik government, is then collected in a fund from which, again, loans will be provided. And Mr. Klein mentioned already the importance of access to finance for businesses, particularly for startups and for small businesses. And that is one of the major problems in the country, actually, that there is really a lack of access to finance, particularly access to finance in local currency, because many businesses take debts in foreign currency, which is not as transparent, and they cannot calculate so good. So that is really a big risk for the businesses there. We also have, as a KfW Banking Group, another part of our businesses, which is called DEG, the German Investment and Development Corporation. And this bank from KfW Banking Group is direct financing private sector investments. So in Tajikistan, for example, we finance with equity share a hotel which was built also with a developmental purpose. We provided also loans to banks, and we are looking, of course, to finance other investments in agribusiness, infrastructure, manufacturing, for example. As a development bank, when we decide about financing a project, one of the main criteria for us is compliance of the loan applier with environmental and social standards. This is one of the most guiding principles for our investments in foreign countries. When we talk about Tajikistan, just to give you some figures, although it has recently been upgraded to a lower middle income country, it is still one of the poorest countries in the world. 8.2 million population, average per capita income of $1,100 per year. The annual growth in the last years between 6 and 7% was quite high, but now, unfortunately, as the Tajik economy is mostly relying on remittances from migrants working in Russia, and together with the crisis in Russia, the projected annual growth is down to 3 to 4%, and therefore Tajikistan is also suffering from the crisis. It is a mountainous country with long borders with Afghanistan, China, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. When it comes to the private sector, I would like to go back to the panel we had yesterday about the role of governments. And I would like to point out that the less developed countries are, the more a guiding role of the government and the capacity of government institutions actually is needed to strengthen the private sector in these countries, because many improvements still have to be implemented when it comes to reforming the investment climate and the legal framework. Just to give you some examples, recently UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, did an investment policy review of Tajikistan. And they came up with some clear recommendations. I would like just to mention 5. They recommend to clarify foreign direct investment specific legislation, to facilitate company operations, as the costs for business registration are still rather high, and the registration procedures are complicated, and they have to be simplified under a single window. They recommend to simplify the tax regime, tax regime in developing countries, I think, is a very important issue when it comes to strengthening private sector. And unfortunately, in many countries, the tax regime can be rather a barrier. Because if taxes are collected arbitrarily, if the tax inspectors are not under control, and if the rules are not properly implemented, then it can lead to that businesses are overtaxed and they are not able to survive actually. Another issue is for developing countries to improve commercial justice and governance. And last but not least, an issue which was discussed during this conference already frequently, that is capacity building, the development of skills. For example, in Tajikistan, we face a mismatch between the supply and demand for skills, and we don't have enough vocational education institutions to qualify the workers we would need for investments. How does the Tajik government tackle this? At the moment, Tajikistan is preparing a new national development strategy, 2016 to 2013. This, of course, follows the United Nations Agenda 2013, so the Sustainable Development Goals are reflected in this National Development Strategy. And I'm really happy to see that 3 of the main government priorities, which are good education, good governance, and better employment, are all the prerequisites in order to strengthen the private sector, and particularly private sector without good governance and without a qualified workforce can never happen, can never materialize. As I mentioned, in a developing country like Tajikistan, the cooperation between development partners, which are development agencies like the UN agencies, the European Union, but also TICA, for example, as the Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, the cooperation of us with the government in order to push the government to take further reforms is very important. So we have a very strong Development Coordination Council in Tajikistan. I'm, by the way, the deputy chair of this council at the moment. And our task is to coordinate among ourselves, but also to come up with joint positions in our discussions with the Tajik government in order to support them to continue with further reforms. We have set up various working groups. For example, we have a working group on private sector development where we cooperate with the State Committee for Investment, but we also cooperate with the Consultative Council for Improvement of Investment Climate under the President of the Republic of Tajikistan. And this is a public-private dialogue platform where we discuss necessary reforms with all stakeholders, from the businesses, from international investors, and also with the government. And as yesterday and today we have representatives here from various countries, I would also like to make the point that I think in order to implement on the ground the Sustainable Development Goals, even more cooperation between development partners and the governments of developing countries is needed. And therefore, when it comes to Tajikistan, for example, I would like to invite representatives of countries like the Gulf Cooperation Council, like China, or from the Organization of Islamic Countries, which so far, unfortunately, are not member of our Development Cooperation Council, to join us, because I think it is really essential that we have a very broad platform for discussion in order to provide the best possible advice to the government. Let me close with 2 examples of sectors where I think there is a potential for investment, both for foreign direct investment in Tajikistan, but also for local investment. One sector definitely is the energy sector. Tajikistan is rich in hydropower and has a high potential for other renewable energy sources. And the other sector would be the agricultural sector, and particularly to strengthen the irrigated agricultural sector. And here I would like to go back actually to what the Istanbul International Center for Private Sector and Development does. I highly appreciate the initiative which was launched by you to found the AKT Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan Agro-Food Consortium this year to bring together governments to enhance productivity and also to find ways how to further advance local investments into agro-food industry, but also how to attract international investment. And I'm again very happy that the Turkish government is also strongly supporting this initiative. And in Tajikistan, I also have a very good cooperation with the Turkish embassy and the Turkish economic counselor there on all kinds of issues when it comes to strengthening the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Labs. We look forward to partnering with you in the AKT initiative. Briefly to tell you, the center is working on Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan private sector-led cross-border value chain in the region on creating inclusive business models. And as you mentioned, during the feasibility analysis right now, we are encountering the issues, the lack of skilled labor, the governance, and also the requirement of a multi-stakeholder partnerships. Thank you. Now, I would like to move back to you, Mr. Rajab. Being on the board of quite a few business associations, and as a businessman yourself, what do you think the business rationality behind supporting the SDGs, basically saying what is in it for private sector, and also what do you think the companies need to do internally to improve their business model to align them more with the SDGs?
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to note some addresses being done by the United Nations through the development goals, sustainable development goals this year, and something not being before in the millennium. The first one is seeking to make profit is not seen as incompatible with development. And this is a very good signs for the involvement of the private sectors in the development of the reaching or achieving the goals that have been defined. The second thing that also witnesses that the sustainability of and removal of all subsidies and trade barriers, also the free trade and the global businesses, international trade, called and described by the SDGs as the engine for inclusive economic growth. So we have a base already that's been agreed that all those SDGs could not be implemented or executed in and out without the private sector. I'll take you back to MDGs. When we think that the Millennium Goals did not achieve 100% by the global community. We ask ourselves why. And this question, I'm sure that a lot of people would like to reach the secrets of not reaching those goals within all the progress and development has been done through the governments and the private sectors. If you allow me, I would like to quote some Arabic sentences from the Holy Quran. If we go through the 17th golden goals, I call it golden goals, have been defined by the SDGs, And I'm sure what I'm going to quote from the Quran is there in the other holy books of our respected religions. First of all, they were talking that no poverty. And God says, الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله كمثل حبة أنبتت 7 سنابل في كل سنبلة 100 حبة والله يضاعف لمن يشاء والله واسع عليم. The second thing is that no anger. And Allah says, ويطعمون الطعام على حبه مسكينا ويتيما وأسيرا. Healthy and life. Allah says, وثيابك فطهر. Quality education. Allah says, اقرأ. Gender equality. Allah says, أني لا أضيع عمل عامل منكم من ذكر أو أنثى. المياه. Allah says, وجعلنا, the water I mean. Allah says, جعلنا من الماء كل شيء حي. The energy. Allah says, إن يشأ يسكن الريح. والله says, ويسبح الرعد بحمده. And He says, هو الذي يريكم البرق. Productive. Allah says, فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض. Industrialization and innovation. And Allah says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا أنفقوا من طيبات ما كسبتم ومما أخرجنا لكم من الأرض. Reduce inequality. And Allah says, وأنفقوا مما رزقناكم. And says in another sentences, ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم. Climate change, ocean protection, seas protection, forest protections. Allah says, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَلَا تَسْرِفُوا إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْرِفِينَ. Safe cities. Allah says, آمَنَهُم مِّنْ خَوْفٍ. And if we continue to the all 17th of those goals, we can find it in all our holy books. So I think the issue we are facing here, that we have to follow the advances, previous advices being given to us by God from the whole religions through the whole world. By this case, we can reach those goals 100%. I'm quite sure of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajab. Actually, one of the thematic areas that the Istanbul International Center for Private Sector is working on, the Islamic finance, and how to converge the Islamic finance more in implementing the SDGs. So it was very insightful what you shared with us. Now, having listened to the business point of view, now I guess it's time to hear an experienced development practitioner to elaborate more on the issue. Casper, based on your extensive experience, could you please tell us the potential of inclusive business in implementing the SDGs? And as the global policy advisor on the extractive industries and sustainable development in UNDP, why do you think the private sector's involvement in SDGs is essential for the extractive industries?
Okay, thank you very much, Gulsin. And first of all, let me say also thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very impressive event. I've heard some very interesting perspectives and views here during the previous sessions, and I've learned a lot, so I really appreciate you inviting me to engage in this event. So let me start perhaps then first on your broader question about the potential of inclusive business in implementing the SDGs. To just say that I think in general, by their very nature, I think, and how you defined inclusive business there earlier, I think they're of course extremely well aligned with the SDGs. I would say especially on the social and the economic side, so with the poverty and the sort of socially focused goals, including SDG 1 on poverty, but also around the goals that deal with women and jobs, provision of services around health and energy. I think we see some very interesting inclusive business models, especially around energy. I would emphasize that because I see that as a very critical enabler for many of the other SDGs. We also see very interesting models around water sanitation, which I think again is a very key kind of enabler for achieving many of the other SDGs. I think, however, though, that my sense is that there still needs to be a bit of more sort of work to broaden the concept, perhaps, to fit them better with the SDGs, especially when it comes to incorporating the environmental dimension, to really make sure that the concept of inclusive business addresses not only the economic and social, but also the environmental dimensions, and thereby will become sort of a stronger driver of the SDG agenda. So I think the concept as such, inclusive business, has a lot of potential, but it's still somewhat of a niche, I think. So it probably needs a bit more kind of support from governments and development institutions. There needs to be clearer policies and incentives, which I know is being worked on as well, to try to scale up this specific notion of inclusive business. But I think more broadly, however, business and the SDGs is gaining a lot of traction, and as we've seen, there's been a lot of interest, of course, from the private sector itself in the development of the SDGs and now in the implementation. So let me focus just a little bit on the extractive industries, which is one key sector that UNDP is focusing its work on, and as you said, I'm also focusing on in my individual work. So why do we focus on the extractive industries? Well, I think perhaps it's obvious, but the sector is of critical importance in the global economy, and we see that it contributes to about 5% of global GDP in many of our regions, including in the Middle East and North Africa. The contribution is significantly higher, up to 25%. In Africa, it's around 15% of the regional GDP. If you then add the products, sort of services and support that is also linked to the sector, we're talking about significantly larger contributions to economy. It's about 20%. And if you on top of that also add the products that are being produced and developed by using non-renewable natural resources, we see that these resources actually drive up to 45% of the global economy. So it's a crucial sector to focus on also from the SDG perspective. Obviously, it generates significant revenues for many developing economies that are resource rich, and these revenues will then be used to invest in sustainable development. But in addition to that, the sector is of course also critical because it holds the potential to catalyze broader economic development and economic growth, as well as job creation, through the linkages that it can create to the local economy, but also through the significant infrastructure investments that the sector often makes to actually conduct its extractive operations. So it brings a lot of other positive development benefits. At the same time, though, we know that the sector also contributes in many ways to the problems. So we see that the sector often is associated with environmental degradation, growing inequalities, a lack of economic diversification, corruption, conflict, and so on. So because of these both strong positive contributions that the sector can make, as well as the negative contributions or impacts, it has a special role to play, and there's a lot of potential opportunities to engage the sector to be better aligned with the SDGs. So we're right now working on a study to be completed at the end of this year with the World Economic Forum, Columbia University, and something called the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and with some support actually from the German government through GIZ, which is focusing on mapping mining's role in the SDGs. And the focus here is specifically to look at methodologies, frameworks, and examples of how the mining sector can incorporate the SDGs better into its core business activities, so into company standards and policies, management systems, into its leadership principles, and so on. And we see especially that instruments such as environmental and social impact assessments, which is a critical management tool for companies in this sector to understand the impacts of their business and also the opportunities when they're about to make an investment, can be critical tools for also incorporating the SDGs more broadly. So let me just give you kind of a few quick kind of illustrations of the issues that we are looking at in this work, in this report. For example, around SDG 6 on water, we see that mining is, of course, a significant user of water resources, probably one of the most water-intensive industries after agriculture. And often it impacts negatively on water qualities and water access. So here we see that the sector really can do a lot to incorporate this better into its management system when it comes to what it does about water conservation, using water more efficiently in its mining and mining operations, using recycling of the water in new and innovative ways, but also how it can develop its water infrastructure in such a way that can improve access to water for communities around the mining operations. So that's one example. We also see around energy, SDG 7 has to do around energy efficiency, energy access. And here again, we see that mining is extremely energy intensive. And depending on the mine, we see anywhere from 10 to 40% of the operating costs of a mine is about energy, using energy. So clearly there is a strong incentive for business here to use energy more efficiently around its mining operations, and also to start using more renewable energy. And we see that mines increasingly, when they're operating off the grid in remote areas, which is often the case in developing countries, that they are starting to look at how they can develop renewable energy infrastructure to support their mining operations. Again, the same concept here. As they develop this infrastructure, we also see opportunities to collaborate more closely with the public sector and communities to see how the mining energy infrastructure can also be used for access to electricity for the communities around the mine. Another example illustration is around SDG 8, which has to do with job creation and economic growth. And as I mentioned, obviously the sector can play a strong catalytic role here. We see, for example, there was a study recently by the World Gold Council that showed that the biggest single element in benefit distribution for communities and governments from gold mining comes from procurement by the gold mines, and actually not by the taxes and royalties that they pay. So in this study, there were 15 companies participating. In total, they spent $55 billion. And out of those $55 billion, $35 billion were actually on procurement and subcontracting, as opposed to about $10 billion that went to taxes and royalties. So if these resources that are being invested in procurement can be channeled to a greater extent to local enterprises and through sort of the local economy as opposed to subcontracted to international companies, there's a huge development opportunity here for the sector. So what are we then doing internally in UNDP around this, beyond this type of research? Well, we're already working quite extensively to support governments to manage this sector in a way that is more aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we do also work through public-private partnerships in many different ways. One example I can highlight that I think is a good illustration is what we have done in South Africa, which is a big mining country. And one of the challenges that the industry faced there had to do with the negative impact on biodiversity and wetlands in a coal mining area. So here UNDP helped stakeholders in the sector develop mining and biodiversity guideline through a 3-year multi-stakeholder process that was convened by something called the South African Mining and Biodiversity Forum, which included members of the Chamber of Mine and included several government ministries, and it included civil society as well. And this biodiversity guideline has now been adopted by the government, both by the Ministry of Environment as well as Ministry of Mining, and also by the Chamber of Mines and its 69 mining companies. So this is the kind of go-to reference for how to deal with the impacts on biodiversity in South Africa. And I think the interesting part of this model is the process through which this policy was created. It was a sort of a collaborative governance model where the public, private, and civil society came together to figure out the best way to deal with this specific problem. Another sector that we are also working with, and I just want to highlight shortly, briefly, is some work we are doing with the small-scale, low-value mineral sector, where we're working with the European Commission and the group of African, Caribbean, and Pacific states to strengthen this low-value mineral sector in some 40 countries. Basically, the low-value minerals are non-export commodities, so it's industrial minerals, construction materials, dimension stones that mostly are being used for domestic purposes, but very important sector for local economic development and generating economic growth. And here we work with both the small-scale operators of quarries and small mines to incorporate sustainability aspects, everything from human rights and labor rights issues to also look at improving kind of the environmental management of that sector, as well as to look at how we strengthen the sort of the productive capacities of the sector, using better technologies, business skills, and so on. At the same time, this project also includes working with the government and the regulatory agencies of the sector to see how they can play a role in better enforcing these sustainability aspects in that sector. So that's a very concrete example of capacity building and integrating basically the SDGs into this sector. So before I wrap up, let me just give sort of three areas that I think we see needs more attention in order to be able to further sort of scale up the role that the extractive industries can play in the SDGs. The first one has to do with governance, regulations, and transparency, which I think we still see as key in shifting and leading to this kind of paradigm shift towards greater sustainability in the extractive industries and incorporating the SDGs to become more mainstream into the sector's governance. The second one has to do around dialogue and partnerships, as I referred to before. I think there's an increasing recognition that this is important, but multi-stakeholder dialogue really is essential to now sort of build a common vision in any industry sector, I think, but also to build trust and transparency among stakeholders, as well as to come up with more innovative practices and solutions and partnerships to be able to incorporate the SDGs into business operations. And then finally, I think capacity development is still, there's still a huge need for that, both on the public sector side to enable responsible public authorities to implement, monitor, and enforce the policies and regulations that they are putting in place for the extractive industries. But also for other stakeholders to be able to engage in a productive way in these multi-stakeholder dialogues and partnerships that I mentioned. So these are just some of the key elements that we see will need more attention going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Casper. That was very enlightening. At this stage, just to wrap up and contribute what has been discussed by our panelists, I would like to mention briefly about the research that our center conducted this year. We have analyzed 150 successful inclusive business models worldwide. We also conducted a survey among the Turkish private sector to measure their awareness on the inclusive business. And according to the findings, we think that the development of a national strategies on inclusive businesses with a strong focus on innovation and also nationwide awareness-raising campaigns, especially targeting the SMEs and the entrepreneurs. And the last but not least, the social performance indicators for companies would significantly increase the chances of scaling up the inclusive businesses. I'm afraid we will not have time to take questions because we are running late in the program. I would like to ask our panelists if they have any final comments. No. Okay, I would like to thank once again to our panelists for their valuable contributions. Our discussion today revealed that the world needs the private sector more than ever for the global development. It needs private sector's innovation capacity, financial strength, knowledge, and expertise. Private sector's cooperation with all the stakeholders through SDGs will help us to establish a resilient and sustainable economies, which will in return provide a peaceful and decent life for humanity. Thank you for your interest and listening.
Thank you very much to our moderator and our speakers. May I please now kindly invite Her Excellency Sheikha Haya Al Khalifa, diplomat, lawyer, president of the Association of Arab-Turk Dialogue, to present the plug of honor to our moderator and our speakers. This is... Sorry, that was... Okay, this one, I will swap them.
For me?
Yeah, that was for you.
Thank you very much.
That's okay, we will swap them.
It's okay.
Sorry, we will swap them. Thank you very much.
Here, let's change.
For Mr. Kasper. Miss Christian. Thank you. And Mr. Mazen Ibrahim Rajab. Thank you very much again to our speakers and our moderator.